See if you can hear me. Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in workshop number 1. My name is Zhang, and I'm the principal investigator of this project, funded by PCORI to conduct a series of 3 workshops on causal inference methods for time-varying treatments. The next 2 workshops will be led by Dr. Maya Peterson and Jessica Yang. Previously, via collaboration with Dr. Miguel Hernan, I led a couple PCORI-funded methods project that aim to evaluate and apply causal inference methods, such as G methods for addressing CER questions using observational data. Today, I'm happy to have this wonderful opportunity to share with you what I learned. Okay, I cannot do the next slide. Okay. All right. At the end of the workshop, I hope you will have a good understanding of target trial framework, as well as how to implement the framework for designing your observational studies. 3 case studies will be used to show how to apply target trial approach and G methods for analysis, focusing on important considerations. In the next 10 minutes or so, let's watch a video on CIMPOD tool, which is web-based introductory tool for guiding the implementation of the target trial approach. We will then go through 3 case studies regarding design and analysis of observational data that followed target trial framework. In the middle, we'll have 5 minutes break. I'm here with my colleague, Ankar and May. May, would you please remind me about the time at 2:40? So I just want to make sure that we are on time. Need to stop in the middle. Okay, so was that fun or no annoying? It's the first time I sound like a salesperson. Okay, so just to summarize the video, which is the introductory video to show the target trial framework and in general how we're gonna apply that. So to summarize, target trial framework outlines the design of hypothetical randomized experiment that would estimate causal effect of interest, identify an observational database with sufficient information to approximately emulate the target trial, and then emulate the target trial and therefore estimate causal effect of interest specified in the target trial protocol. So those are the general steps of implementing the target trial framework. This slide has been used by Miguel in many presentations. So we need to leave enough room for causal thinking or for the formulation of research question before running the analysis. A well-defined causal question is a question that can be translated into a hypothetical experiment. Causal questions that cannot be translated into target experiments are not sufficiently well-defined. So the process of specification and emulation is the process of formulating a well-defined research question. Now we can look at the details of case study number 1, which delineates exactly how we follow the target trial framework and conduct emulation of observational of the target trial. A little background. In the case studies that we're going to go over today, we're comparing EPO treatment strategies. EPO therapy is received routinely by dialysis patients to correct their anemia. Nearly all dialysis patients are anemic, meaning they have low hematocrit values. Until today, optimal hematocrit target is unknown. The largest RCT, which is called normal hematocrit study, compared two target hematocrit levels, 39 to 45% and 27 versus 27 to 30%. However, the most commonly used EPO treatment strategies in practice, which is less than 39%, have never been evaluated. So the research question we want to address in this case study is to update the normal hematocrit study and to evaluate treatment strategies that are actually used in practice. Data that we use is the USRDS data system, which has detailed longitudinal record of utilization, diagnosis, and procedures of all dialysis patients covered by Medicare. The database provide monthly time-varying values of EPO treatment, including EPO dose, route of administration, and number of administrations, and also hematocrit values at the beginning of each month. So this rich database provides us with the opportunity to address complex time-varying EPO therapy research questions. So this table, you can start with any component of target trial to specify and emulate. Here we start with eligibility criteria, specification and emulation of eligibility criteria. You might also want to start with defining the treatment strategies, because by doing so, you immediately will know whether you have a causal question or not. Because many times we're so used to associating prediction problems, and they have a very clear difference between prediction problems and the causal questions. So the left side is the specification of the target trial. The right side is how to identify study population using USRDS data based on same eligibility criteria as specified on the left column. So first, you specify your target population with criteria 1, 2, 3, 4, and then emulate each criteria using your available data. So this is a larger view of the previous slide. I want to use this slide to illustrate the 3 keywords that we saw from the video, the 3 keywords are parallel, iterative, and explicit. This table reflects the parallel process because for each eligibility criteria, we have the specification and the emulation side by side. The process is iterative. For example, originally we want to specify blood pressure requirement as eligibility, but USRDS does not include blood pressure data. So it's not feasible to emulate, and therefore we had to remove that criteria from the specification column. To be explicit, we can include in the emulation column details regarding data source, variable name, and variable value that were used for the emulation. For example, for criteria number 2 that listed in this slide, we included the ICD-9 code in the appendix that are used to define CHF and IHD. Delineating and documenting every criteria can be time-consuming at the beginning, but it provides a scientific description of causal effect that we are estimating and how we are going to estimate. So this is an example that what you will do by following the modules that included in the CIMPOD tool. So the left column is emulation box. The right 3 columns are the left is specification, and the right 3 boxes are emulation. This is a flow chart that is very useful and should be included in your manuscript to report your study population explicit study eligibility criteria, which is consistent with the PICO format. So study baseline. Study baseline is defined after you finish the specification and emulation of the eligibility criteria, you establish the study baseline. It is defined as the first time when all the above eligibility criteria are met, which also referred as time zero. Updating time zero involves redefining eligibility. I consider this as the most important slide of our workshop today. The concept of time of eligibility is the same. They are equal to each other. Time of eligibility is baseline, is time zero, is the time of randomization, is treatment assignment, is start of follow-up, and is start of counting endpoints. So we need to clarify this concept when we need to synchronize the it's very natural to align them up when specifying the target trial because it's the basic requirement for any RCT protocol in which time of eligibility is baseline when randomization happens and treatments are assigned. However, in observational studies, we often fail to do so because we're used to the associational thinking. Bias may occur when these times are misaligned, as demonstrated by many publications. These biases would include reverse causation, immortal time bias, selection bias, etc. In addition to residual confounding, this misalignment issue poses serious threat to validity of observational study. For example, researchers have found almost 70% of pharmacoepi papers based on observational data had design issues that can cause immortal time bias. The specification and emulation process of target trial greatly help us in making sure of synchronization. Okay, now we continue with the process of specification and emulation. Emulation of the specified treatment strategies is the core of the target trial approach. Is a key component for successful emulation of the target trial. For the case of analyzing, for the case of comparing time-varying treatment strategies, we need very high quality and rich observational data, which is often a barrier for us to move forward with comparison of time-varying treatment strategies. Okay, so in this case study, we want to compare 3 dynamic treatment strategies: low hematocrit, mid hematocrit, and high hematocrit target strategies. So we go through the same specification and emulation process. Target trial, we specify what we want to do. And for the emulation column, we describe how we want to do it using USRDS data. I won't spend a lot of time today talking about how we define treatment strategies, the dynamic treatment strategies. One thing that we need to keep in mind is that my assumption is that everybody now understands the difference between the point intervention and sustained intervention, and the difference between static and dynamic interventions. Do we need to clarify that? I think we're clear on that. So for dynamic treatment strategies, we need to define trigger and resulting information. And another thing I want to clarify is that the dynamic rules that we specified in the study protocol is fixed, although the actual treatment varies. So there are many different ways that we can define how we're going to operationalize the therapy. So for example, we can have this rule algorithm number one, which is a static deterministic rule. We can force hematocrit to be a desired value, although that will be not this treatment strategy is poorly defined because we do not know how to. The how to part is not defined. And also we can force dose to be a certain value. For example, we can say the treatment strategies is that starting from the start of follow-up to the end of study, patients constantly receive a constant EPO dose of 1500 at all time for low hematocrit strategy. And there could be many other similar rules. The next set of treatment strategy that the algorithm, it can be called dynamic deterministic, meaning that we define that based on, for example, fixed change. If hematocrit is less than 30%, we increase dose 10%. Otherwise set to the natural value. Natural value means that simply no intervention, do nothing. And threshold intervention, hematocrit less than 30%, we increase dose up to 3,000 units. So the 3,000 units is the threshold level that we define. Otherwise, set to the natural value. So many other similar rules. This example I'm giving you are those typical rules that have been used in the published studies. And this set is joint interventions. In practice, EPO is generally oftentimes in together with iron treatment to correct their anemia. So we can define the joint interventions for both EPO and iron. So for the treatment strategy we want to define, we have two components, which is EPO and iron. Now, here's our dynamic deterministic rule. Okay, so here's how we define our treatment strategies. For example, for low hematocrit target strategy, if hematocrit is less than 30%, increased dose is likely 15%. If hematocrit is greater than 33%, dose is decreased 15%. If hematocrit is in between, set dose to prior dose. So similarly, we can use the same way, very similar way to define mid hematocrit and a high hematocrit strategy. The reason that we use these rules for our treatment strategy is to reflect real world practice, to address population decision making, and to take full advantage of existing data. One thing I want to clarify is that we often need to rely on subject matter knowledge as clinicians to get idea about how exactly to define treatment strategies, because we want to use the strategy that are most likely to be used in practice so that we can get the sufficient support from observational data. So causal contrast of interest. In our case, we use per protocol effect because we are analyzing dynamic treatment regimens. It's not meaningful to evaluate intention to treat effect for our case. Now, I want to get into the analysis of this case study in which we use the parametric G-formula approach. Before we get into an analysis, I want to go through a little bit about how we're going to prepare analytical data to get the data ready for analysis, which is hard work. We want to make sure that data is formatted in the way that is in person time format. So time variable begins at time 0, and time index is increased by 1 subsequently. And oftentimes we need to generate variables to reflect the lagged values. previous values, and also we need to define the end of records correctly, which often is the earliest of censoring events. For time failure outcome, we can define that the reaching will be the last line of the record. So here is one of the example data structure that we will have. So we have a patient ID variable, time variable increasing over time by 1, fixed covariate, which are the baseline covariates. They don't change over time. We have time varying covariate. For example, hematocrit values, it varies with time. And also, those last two follow-up time also varies for different patients, and we define outcome. So outcome missing at the last line of the record for each patient. The outcome is missing, meaning that because we are predicting what will happen to the patients in the next record. So baseline data structure, you need to go through a lot of quality control procedures to make sure that you have construct your analytical data appropriately. You have to do a lot of testing, and because the importance of this step to make sure that you have construct the data correctly is so important, because once you know that you have constructed your data correctly, when you have great confidence of applying the analytical methods to your data. So these are some quality control ways that I often use. I want to share with you. For example, you can do a flow chart. So that you can see that attrition of patient population, they have to add up accumulative over time. And you can do descriptive tables, and many times you can find immediately a problem. For example, time is not increased by 1, and the patient count, the number of deaths, does not add up, or some variable is should not be missing but is missing. So, and I'm sorry, what's that?
Your voice is cutting.
Okay. You cannot? Oh, okay. Oh, all right. So I think I just need to keep my head stable. So that, is that the way?
So far, there's been
okay.
Speed's very good.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I want to go through the implementation steps that I use for the parametric G-formula approach. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the parametric G-formula approach. So in general, is a generalization of standardization. So I think the general steps are, the first step, you need to model everything. The second step is simulate everything. Here's the key part, under the pre-specified treatment strategy, G. And the last step, you want to do Monte Carlo simulation and calculate the confidence intervals using the bootstrap approach. So those are the general steps. It allows presence of measured time varying confounders, as we saw in the video. If we have dynamic treatment strategies, the analytical approach that we end up with are G methods and TMLE. Standard methods do not work. I use the G formula SAS macro. I'm not sure if you have already tried using this SAS macro. It's not difficult to learn to use this macro, and it can be a lot of fun actually to use this macro to compare the treatment strategies that you have. It's user-friendly and not difficult to learn. And it's free. You can download from the Harvard website. We conducted several sensitivity analysis. These analyses you often must do when you when you apply the G methods approach for to compare dynamic treatment regimens. The most important sensitivity analysis you want to do is to compare simulated versus observed. And you want to test out the different rules. That's one of the advantage of G formula approach, because the advantage of using the size macro, because it's very easy for you to change the definition of treatment strategies and just run the macro again to see if you have consistent results. This is related to the sensitivity analysis that I just talked about, which is to compare the observed risk versus parametric versus natural course. Comparison of observed covariate means versus simulated under natural course. This is a way to test the presence of informative sensory and or growth model misspecification. This is a report that we include in the manuscript that we published. So the left column is the observed dotted line under the natural course, estimated natural course. The right column is the difference between observed and natural course estimated, and they are 95% point-wise confidence intervals. We test the model in many different ways, with many, for example, many different, meaning that we specify the model in many different ways to come up with with this curve. Meaning you probably will doing the same thing because model misspecification is oftentimes is a major disadvantage of using the G formula approach. So by doing this sensitivity analysis, it doesn't guarantee that you do not have model misspecification problems, but it's an indication that you did not severely deviate from the correct analysis. Okay, now it's 2:40. Okay, I'm almost over here. So we're good with time. And then I want to talk about a little bit about what to report. You need to report patient population, like I said, the flow chart, patient characteristics, and unadjusted rates. You need to report causal effect under observed natural course and each hypothetical intervention, population risk ratio, cumulative incidence of outcome, average and cumulative percent intervened upon. So the last bullet point is to assess extrapolation. To continue, subgroup analysis, observed versus simulated, and programming codes. Very interesting, all the G formula, all my publications that I found that use SAS G formula macro, they all report their programming codes, including our study. So I strongly suggest that look at the supplemental material to see exactly how each study implement the G formula approach. So, according to our timeline, are we going to have a 5 minutes break now or later?
Later.
Okay, all right, okay. So I think we're good with time, and I will slow down a little bit to talk about case study number 2. Case study number 2. still look at dynamic dosing strategies, but it used a different approach. It used IPW approach. At the end of the case study 2 and 3, I will summarize the difference between G formula approach and IPW approach, and under what conditions that we want to use which strategy, which approach for analysis. So we're seeing this process again. It's a process that the specification and emulation process, is a process that we want to get familiar with. Once we get used to this process, meaning that imagining or conceptualizing a target trial approach, and then think about how I use my data, existing data, to emulate this trial. Once we get used to this process, when we report our study, we may not need to, like what I did in my 2 publications. Basically, I described very clearly what is a target trial, what is the emulation of the target trial side by side, in every detail. But you keep that in mind. Once you get used to this process, you can describe your study, how you conduct your study, just from the right column only. So, but keep that in mind that you are emulating a target trial. So we cannot see. Can you see very clearly the slides? Or maybe, okay. So let me see. Okay. I still want to go back to the treatment strategy part because I think that's very important for us to, okay. So in this study, we're still comparing hematocrit targeted strategies. In this case, we're comparing two strategies. The difference between this study and last study is as follows. Number one, we are patient population. Here we are focusing on incident dialysis patients because we want to evaluate ESA initiating strategies at the beginning. Once people had never used ESA before, and they're initiating hematocrit management strategies. That's one difference. The second difference is that the way we define the treatment strategies is different. The last case study, we define, for example, the rules for how to achieve how to achieve the target hematocrit is different. Last time we say, for example, low hematocrit strategy, if the observed is below the lower end of the target, we increase exactly by 15%. That's what we had last time. But over here, we had a range of, so we're saying over here, the rule is that if observed is below the lower end of the target range, we increase at least 10%. So it is a range. So that's the difference regarding the way we define treatment strategies. And the reason I want to emphasize is that the way that how you define your treatment strategy, what exactly the treatment strategy you want to compare for, related to the choice of analytical methods, which I'll talk about this later. Another thing that I want to clarify here is that we often hear the terms of new user design. The new user design means that the new treatment strategy doesn't mean that you have, for example, the last case study we look at, we require a patient to use ESA before baseline because we mimic the normal hematocrit study. That's their in the randomized trial. that was the eligibility criteria. So they're not new users of ESA. However, they are the new users of treatment strategies that we want to compare for. Meaning that at time 0, that's the time for treatment assignment. So once we have that in mind, once we line up our thinking of designing observational studies with the target trial, we can avoid a lot of bias issues originated from designing observational studies. Okay, so this table shows the study endpoints. Again, that in the left column, we show what's the endpoint that we want to examine in the target trial, and then the right column we describe exactly how we define those outcome variables using USRDS data. For statistical analysis in this case, we conducted both intention to treat analysis and per protocol analysis. Should we take a break now or continue?
Do you have one more case study after this one?
Yes.
Let's finish this one and then maybe take a break before the third one.
Okay.
Very short.
Okay. So now I want to summarize in this how we gonna implement the IPW approach to analyze dynamic treatment regimens. Basically, there are 3 steps. Number 1 is cloning. Assign each person to all treatment strategies that are consistent with their observed data at time 0, and we create expanded data set with copies of patient information to avoid immortal time bias. There are several publications on the scenarios that might be associated with not doing so. So I include those studies in the further readings at the end of this today's workshop. Those publications very helpful for us to understand how we do cloning and how we assign treatment strategies at time 0. Step number 2 is artificial censoring. This step is to ensure that people follow their assigned treatment strategy after time 0, meaning that once they deviate from their originally assigned treatment strategies, we artificially censor them. By doing so, we artificially create selection bias. Number 3 is use inverse probability weighting to eliminate selection bias. Uncensored individuals receive a weight equal to the inverse of their probability of being uncensored. Pretty much all the studies that have implemented the IPW approach followed the 3 steps that described here. I use these slides to show the difference between the definition of treatment strategies used in this study with the basically how we define treatment strategy used in this study by using the IPW approach. So we compared the effects of 2 hematocrit targets, like I said earlier, that we specify rules or algorithms. The dosing titration is a range, not one specific value. So I highlighted those titration patterns titration for the dosing algorithms using those red highlights. So emulation of treatment strategies. This is done by cloning, the next step number one, like we discussed before. So during the first month of follow-up, the patient is classified as following a strategy if her treatment data are consistent with the specified rules. The patient is not eligible for the study if her treatment data are not consistent with either strategy. That patient is out. If a patient's treatment data are consistent with both treatment strategies, we clone the patient's data and assign each clone to one of the two treatment strategies. So that created expanded data set. So in the expanded data set, I mean for the clones of data, the only difference is that the treatment strategies. One clone is following treatment strategy A. The other clone is following the treatment strategy B. For example, if observed hematocrit is 20, for example, is 29, and observed this and the patient received a dose that is increased by 10% or more. So this patient is clearly following two treatment strategies because the observed data of this patient is consistent with both pre-specified treatment strategies, low hematocrit and mid hematocrit that we want to compare. So for this patient, we are cloning this patient with two sets of data that is exactly the same except for the treatment strategy. So it's straightforward. And the cloning idea is not just unique to the IPW approach. It's for G formula approach. It's the same. I think it's the common universal idea for all causal inference studies, because we are estimating is that what would happen to the entire population if the entire population is following the same treatment strategy. So I think they have definitely connection there. Artificial censoring. In per-protocol analysis, patients and clones are artificially censored when their treatment data are not consistent with their originally assigned treatment strategy, meaning they stop following their originally assigned treatment strategy. For example, if patient is assigned to the low hematocrit strategy, if observed hematocrit is lower than the lower end, you're supposed to increase according to the rule, right? You need to increase dose. However, the patient received lower dose, then we artificially censor this patient at that moment. There are many scenarios related to following and deviating. So for this, so we need to have a decision tree or a process to describe very clearly about the scenarios that you are following the treatment strategy and the scenarios that you're deviating. So this graph shows that why we want to use inverse probability weighting to eliminate selection bias resulted from artificial censoring. So if we condition on C, which is artificial censoring, you can see that it is a dissident of a collider L. So by conditioning on that, we will generate selection bias. And the traditional technique using conditioning would not work for this case. That's why we want to use weighting to adjust for artificial censoring. So this is the decision tree that I was just talk about in the previous slide. So basically, the idea is that for each path, you show, is this a censoring path, or is this a following uncensored path? So the reason that we want to make this very clear is because that for a path that would never be censored, artificially censored. For example, if a patient went to a hospital, USRDS data does not include the ESA use in the inpatient setting. So for this case, we do not know we do not have the information. For this case, that we are assuming that the patient is following the originally his or her original assigned treatment strategies. If the patient can never be artificially censored, he or she needs to receive a treatment weight of 1. So we need to do a decision tree of this to exactly describe the scenarios that we need to estimate treatment weights so that we can include it weights in the final analysis, weighted analysis. In this study, we conduct both intention to treat analysis and the pool protocol analysis. For intention to treat analysis is a pooled logistic regression model to estimate probability of death. The model was fit to the expanded data set. To adjust for potential selection bias due to censoring by loss to follow-up, we estimated stabilized inverse probability weights. So for per protocol analysis, we estimate the effect as effect estimate if all subjects had adhered to their baseline strategy throughout the entire follow-up. So that's the idea of per protocol, right? So fit the models to the expanded data set after artificial censoring. So the key idea is that for both intention to treat and per protocol analysis, you want to apply to the expanded data set, not the original data set. The clone the data set with copies, that's the one that you want to use for the final analysis. Now, for the estimation of weights, you need to use original data sets for calculating the inverse probability weights. And there are different ways for calculate weights for intention to treat analysis and per protocol analysis. For intention to treat analysis, we need to adjust for loss to follow-up. For per protocol analysis, we need to adjust for both loss to follow-up and artificial censoring. Okay, I think it's good time for us to take a break, and then we will come back
But you
later.
don't want them to leave, not log out, right? Just
Right.
walk away.
Right, or we can finish case study number 3 and not taking the break. So what do we do? Okay, how you feel about it?
It's only been an hour.
Okay, but I can finish this up soon.
Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect
so
then. And then
yeah,
time for Q&A?
yes,
Okay.
okay. Okay, let me do it. So the case study number 3, we are comparing timing strategy using IPW approach. If we say that the previous 2 case studies are success, should we say this failure? I'm not sure, but basically we spend a lot of time on this study and we were not able to conduct study to a degree that we feel that the study results are valid. But we're working on it. Just to summarize that, that the lessons that we learned from these studies. The matter of fact is that not every target trial can be emulated using observational data. So a little background. We were looking at, previous two studies were looking at EPO treatment strategies among dialysis patients. It's very similar in the CKD non-dialysis patient population, and that is optimal initiating ESA therapy treatment strategies is unknown. So in this study, we want to compare ESA, meaning at what time to start ESA therapy among CKD population is unknown. So we want to compare ESA initiating strategies for hemoglobin threshold between 9 and 11. And in this case, we use much-field electronic health records. Unlike the dialysis patient who have the USRDS data that is rich, validated, and available to every researchers, is very difficult to find data source among CKD population. So that is one of the major challenge, again, for conducting CER study using observational data to compare dynamic treatment regimens, because it has high requirement for rich and high quality data. Definition of treatment strategies in this case. These are called threshold or timing strategies. We want to compare 3 threshold, 11, 10, and 9. For 11 threshold, initiate ESA when hemoglobin decreases below 11. So in dialysis patient, we say hematocrit. In CKD, we change to hemoglobin, but they are pretty much the same thing. Yeah, so, but why don't we make it consistent? So emulating a pragmatic trial in which patients with hemoglobin less than 11 who have not used the ESA in the previous year. So that's the trial that we want to emulate. And for this study, there is a new idea I want to introduce, which is a grace period. A grace period is a designated time period in which an intervention can happen, right? This grace period. For this case, it's 4 weeks. ESA need to be initiated within 4 weeks. That is the grace period after reaching the assigned threshold. Again, we're doing the 3 steps because we're using EPW approach, analyzing dynamic treatment regimen. 3 steps: cloning, artificial centering, and waiting. For the first step, we created 3 exact copies of each patient's data. For artificial centering, we need to do exactly like what we did last time, which is that decision tree. We had a very complex decision tree for this case. That's why I did not put in here. It's complicated and not very easy to envision. But basically, in the decision tree, we show how exactly we emulate those thresholds using the available data. And for different thresholds, there are different scenarios. So at the time of ESA initiation, if they start ESA before reaching the threshold, right? That means that for this scenario, we need to censor them because they deviate from the treatment strategies that we assign them to at the beginning. And also 4 weeks after reaching the hemoglobin threshold, 4 weeks after, meaning that within the grace period, right? So if they do not receive ESA during okay. So artificial censoring, what does it mean? Anka, do you remember if we do not? Okay. Oh, yes. So you're supposed to initiate treatment strategy if it goes below. But if you don't, it's the opposite. You need to artificially censor at that time point. So we did a decision tree for this, and there are several publications on the timing strategies by using the IPW approach, and they pretty much all have a decision tree in the supplemental material, or may not be a figure, but at least they describe the same scenario very clearly about when they are artificially censored. So I think that's the key part. The key part of using IPW approach to compare dynamic treatment regimens is that a clear definition about how you artificial censor patients. Yeah. So construction of IP weights, same idea. Artificial censoring introduces selection bias, and we use weighting to adjust for this bias. This is also complicated. We divide follow-up into 4 periods. And for each period, we have a formula to calculate how we're gonna model that period and calculate the treatment weights. Is that correct, Ankar?
So it's what they reach the threshold, and between the threshold till they get treated. And again, when they come back and study this, you actually calculate against it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So when we have the decision tree, and on the top of the decision tree, we have a note about how we're going to model this path. Yeah. So the difficulties that we experienced that lead to a failure to the emulation of the targeted strategies. Number one, unexpectedly, we had few patients receive ESA. Previously, it was estimated that about 30% of CKD population receive ESA. And that was the expectation that we had by talking with the data people before we got funding for this study, right? But actually, when the data sent to us, we looked in the entire
that's
world.
unique to our study.
Right.
The people who are listening may not.
Okay.
This won't happen to them.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, that's good. Okay, so that's the number one. Very few patients receive ESA. And the second reason is that ESA treatment is not consistent with CPGs,
Clinical practice guidelines.
practice guidelines, right? We just cannot find a treatment strategy that is supported by data. Every treatment strategy that we specify in the target trial column, we cannot emulate by using the data. Very few. So in that case, every model we build, regardless approach that we're going to use, what happens is that our results will rely on too much on extrapolation of observed data. Okay, so I think that's the major reason that and the lessons we learned is that intractable confounding sometimes occurs, and that's the case with our analysis. survival curves for when we look at the results, the survival curves always indicated that patients receiving EPO had a higher mortality rates, and that doesn't make much sense. And no matter how many variables we adjusted for, that was always the case. We could not identify baseline or time-varying covariates to adjust for confounding. So, so the lessons that we learned from here is that we need a standardized, and that was the Miguel's point when we were working on this study. He said that we need a standardized framework to decide when observational data is appropriate for causal inference. These standard guidelines for researchers to ensure feasibility of conducting causal analysis. Otherwise, we risk finding too many biased estimates in the literature. Very quickly, I want to summarize the difference between the G formula and IPW approach, similarities, disadvantages, pros and cons. So G formula adjusts for time-varying confounders affected by prior exposure. That is the same for IPW approach. Compare multiple treatment strategies simultaneously. That's the same for IPW approach. Yes, I think in terms of, I want to add, in terms of defining the treatment strategies to compare, G formula is much more flexible compared to IPW approach. I want to add that point. And also the assumptions. I did not go through the assumptions today, but these are very important assumptions. And by making the emulation process explicit, we can make the assumptions that we use in the study explicit. For example, in the analysis, if we very clearly describe what covariates that we adjust for, that means that we are assuming that by adjusting for those exact covariates, we are sufficiently adjust for confounding. So the process just make the assumption very explicit. That's the advantage of using the target trial approach. And that's the same for both methods. So G formula models for each time varying covariates that are an outcome. So that is what I said for the G formula approach. At the very first step for G formula approach, it needs to model everything and using the results, the coefficient from those models and simulate data under the treatment G. So that's the G formula approach. So it rely heavily rely on the model specific model specification. So that is a disadvantage of G formula approach. So G formula is sensitive to model misspecification. Violation. Okay, but on the other hand, IPW approach is sensitive to near violation of positivity assumption. Okay, and that's the major reason that we are not using the IPW approach for case study 2 and 3. No, that's no. Okay, I think it's the opposite, right? So, okay, I got it. So that's the reason we did not use IPW approach for case study number 1, because by defining the treatment strategy in case study number 1, we are saying that we increase those exactly by 15% if observed hematocrit is below the lower end of the target. And that if we use IPW approach, because it's sensitive to positivity assumption that we will not be able to use IPW approach to do the analysis. On the other hand, by using the G formula, we can G formula is flexible for continuous treatment strategies because it uses a fully parametric approach. Okay, that's the conclusion. Very straightforward. Target trial approach is a helpful tool for both design and analysis of observational data. I try to manage to put the studies, the references for the readings in one page. These are I found very helpful. So for the counterfactual theory and the G methods, read Miguel's book. Freely downloadable, available online. You enter causal inference, Harvard causal inference, Miguel, you will see immediately. The first thing come up should be this book. This book is not very theoretical. I think that you can follow through easily for the complex causal inference idea. Another book I did not put in is the Book of Why by Julie Pearl. That's also very helpful. For target trial framework, Miguel's paper using big data to emulate, that's very helpful paper for the introduction of target trial framework. And regarding the most important point that I described today about immortal time bias, read the second paper on the target trial framework. So the rest of the references, those are 4 references related to how we're gonna apply G formula approach and IPW approach in actual clinical studies. Those studies I found very helpful. I think those, I think these are the very helpful studies for us to understand both theory and the way and approach to implement causal inference methods for analysis. So I'm glad, yes, I'm glad that we can finish up early because I feel like the main point we have already covered. Did I miss anything?
Case
Yes.
studies are helpful.
Okay, so now please let me know if you have any questions. You can send in your questions via the chat function, and so we can have.
I will let you know.
Okay, if you don't have questions, please do the survey. Ankar, did you send out the survey? The survey we have very short survey. It's definitely just take you 1 minute to finish. Yes, it's a 6 question. You just do a reading, and if you like, which is optional, you can give us your suggestions about your thoughts of today's workshop and also future 2 workshops. The next workshop is scheduled for March 15th, 2019, between 9:30 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. This workshop number 2 will be led by Dr. Maya Peterson from UC Berkeley.
You have a very good question.
Yes.
A question of all questions.
Mhm.
The person does not understand the cloning idea.
Oh,
That's because it's very complicated. And it is essential and integral to applying IPW and the G formula.
okay. Let me see. Let me see if I can address this question. Okay. Let me go back to that slide. Okay, here.
They say it seems like you are making up data. Is the idea that people get censored quickly?
Let me see, where is the data? Oh, number one. Okay, preparing the data. So technically, how exactly we clone? All right, this is related to like data management, but it's not difficult to do. For example, for this case, suppose that we have what is missing in this table is one more. Suppose we only have like one baseline variable, which is age, right? One baseline variable, one time varying variable, which is hemoglobin. Okay, what's missing here is a treatment strategy variable. So you can have a treatment strategy variable, and for this patient number one, you will have you copy the patient's data exactly the same, but the only thing that's different is treatment strategy. So for you have one treatment strategy A. For this case, for patient number one, you have treatment strategies for 3 times. If it is not, this patient is not censored, it's followed to the end. You can have 1 at the very beginning, at the time 0, right? At month 1, you assign the patient to 2 different strategies. So everything else is the same. All the other variable values exactly the same. Copy this patient's data, but you just have a clone of this patient. The only difference is that the treatment strategy variable is different. One is treatment strategy A, the other one is treatment strategy B.
I think the person is having trouble understanding how you can have more than one treatment, that you would only have one strategy. How can one person have more than one strategy? It's the potential, isn't it? It's the potential of having more than one treatment strategy that it's unknown which strategy you end up with. Isn't that why we clone people?
Right. So this is related to the counterfactual is related to the emulating of the target trial. See, at the beginning, at the time 0, you want to assign the entire population to treatment A. The other group is to treatment B, right? So does that address the question?
No, I think that
because the patient observed data is consistent, is compatible with both treatment strategies.
Right. That's the issue. That the person's data is
it's
not always
compatible.
the case, and not everyone can be cloned or is cloned. But for those who are cloned, it's because their data is compatible with more than one treatment strategy. And that might happen the whole time, or they may eventually.
Using the examples that I gave, right?
Yeah.
The low hematocrit strategy and high hematocrit strategy. At time 0, this patient data is consistent with both strategies. So if you just assign this patient to one treatment strategies, you will generate bias because immortal time bias, because people who died that can never be artificially censored, correct?
The person is saying, by month 1, I would expect them to be in one or the other. How can they either have low, moderate, or high hematocrit, right?
At the assignment, at the treatment assignment, which is month 0, they can have if their data is consistent with all 3.
But if they're in the low, they could still be in the medium and the high.
Correct.
See, that's what you have to understand. If you're in the high, then that's it. That's one strategy. But you're in the low, you have the potential of being both in the low, the medium, and the high. So you get cloned 3 times. The best thing to do would be to read some of the papers that we have about that.
Well,
they have
we can
more
explain.
detail about.
For example,
cloning.
for example, the threshold strategy, right? At time 0, if a patient is following the observed data is consistent with 9 threshold, of course, this patient, the data is consistent with 10 and 11.
Right, because you see, 11, the threshold at 11 is defined as anything below 11. So if you're at 9, you're at the 9 and below, the 10 and below, and the 11 and below. So your treatment strategy is compatible with all 3 of the treatments that we're looking at, the strategies. If you're just below 11, then you're only compatible with 1. So that's why you clone. It took us all a long time to wrap our minds around it too. But really, that's how it works. It's not any more complicated than that.
And the immortal time bias is the major bias that can be generated by assigning patient to just one treatment strategy instead of all treatment strategies that are consistent with the observed data. Because people who had outcome, like for example, people that the outcome they are interested in with is death, is that is not considered a deviation of treatment strategy. Yeah. I hope that that it is complex.
It is
idea.
very complicated.
It is a complex idea.
And the idea that, yeah, then you publish based on your sample size increases incredibly. You have the same number of patients, but then you have so many more strategies. But that's in that particular case where we're looking at timing.
Right. So consider.
That helps, thanks. But it sounds like you don't clone everybody. No, you do not clone everybody. It depends on what you start with.
Okay. Yes, that I can clarify. You don't clone everybody. Suppose that the observed at the time 0, the observed patient data is not consistent with any pre-specified treatment strategies you are interested in to compare. That patient is out. For this case, the eligibility criteria would include the assignment of treatment strategy because that's the definition. Time 0, I mean the assignment of treatment strategies is baseline, is the time that the patient met all the baseline criteria, meaning that if a patient data is not consistent with any treatment strategies you want to compare, that patient is out because it's not just like in clinical trials, that patient is not selected to enroll in the trial. So think about the target trial idea. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah,
is that helpful?
Yes, it is. He's moving on. Thank you. Okay. And I do not see any other questions right now. Do you, Ankar? And people were asking about the availability of the presentation and the slides. We will make them available to everyone in a few days. So look out for that. The webinar workshop number 2, March 15th, will of course send you a reminder.
Right. And Ankar, did you send out the survey?
And he did, yes. He sent out the survey. They just have to click on it. So please, it's 5 questions. It would really be helpful to us.
Right.
And
Exactly. I think that'll be helpful. And right. And I'll be working with Jessica and Maya for future workshops. Really, if you have any suggestions, let me know. Any case studies or that you feel like is very interesting and want to learn from them, also let me know.
Yes, we will be sharing the slides.
Okay.
Okay,
very good. And I want to thank you very much for joining in, and looking forward to
March 15th, yes, and hearing back from anybody.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.